Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast. My name is Philip and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 34, Casina, the Unseen Bride. Last time, Plautus, our earliest Roman playwright with surviving works, took centre stage, as he often liked to do. He was certainly a man immersed in theatre, and as best as we can tell, involved in every aspect of keeping theatre alive in the period of the temporary stage and marketplace performance. Now it's time to look for the first time at a Latin play in detail. It seems quite a while since we looked at plays in detail with Menander, but keep him in mind. As you know, the Roman plays are adapted from Greek New Comedy, something we're often reminded about by the Roman playwrights themselves. Casina, as with other Plautus plays, opens with a prologue, but this particular one is of more interest to us than others that simply explain the upcoming plot points or some necessary backstory. In this case, the prologue comes from a later period, perhaps close to a generation after the original production. The obvious conclusion is that the text we have here is from a revival, and as such, we can be sure that this play retained its popularity for a considerable period of time. After initial pleasantries to the audience, the prologue continues like this. Those who make use of aged wine, I think, are wise, and those too, who through choice like to watch old plays. Since antique works and words are pleasing to you, this older play should be for your enjoyment too. For the new comedies which come out nowadays are more worthless than even new-coined money. Since we've heard the report in public that you ardently wish for this piece of Plautus, we have rehearsed this ancient comedy of his, which the older ones amongst you have already enjoyed, but I'm aware that the younger ones are not acquainted with it. Still, for you we will act our finest moves, and prove through our best endeavours what a joy this old play is. When it was first presented, it had no rival, and those old departed poets will now inspire us, as they watch down on us and we give our all. Of all the plays, this prologue stands out as particularly self-aware. Maybe 20 or 30 years on from its original production, we're still in the period of the temporary theatre, taking place as part of a festival, in a marketplace, or even in the forum itself. The general opinion of the text is that it's not much changed from the original, with the initial lines of the prologue being the only obvious amendment. That prologue still fulfills its traditional function of calling on the audience and getting their attention. In this case, the tool is flattery, praising the good taste of those gathered, and then embarking on a bit of audience participation, calling out for applause and encouragement. The prologue points out that this is the holiday season, and those watching should kick back, forget their worries, and enjoy themselves. The prologue then reminds the audience of the play's heritage, that it was written in Greek by Diphilus and reinvented in Latin by Plautus. With maybe a gesture upstage, the prologue then introduces the scene to be played out against the backdrop of the two doorways. He explains how years ago a child was found and taken in by a husband and wife and used as their slave, but treated kindly. 16 years have passed since then, and now the couple's son has fallen in love with the girl. But worse still, the old man has fallen for her too. Both men plan to have the girl by a cunning means, and they happen to have hit on the same idea. They will arrange for the girl to marry their own slave, so they will then be able to share her. The young man can therefore keep a good reputation, and the old man can keep his young mistress a secret from his wife. But, the prologue continues, the plot is discovered by the old man's wife, and she sides with her son to ensure her husband's plans are thwarted. The father, however, acts fast and has sent his son away. This last part of the plotting is thought to be part of Plautus's augmentation of the Greek original, which, of course, we don't have, so we can only guess, but such speculation is prompted and supported by lines in the prologue like this. His mother understands this. She lends her absent son assistance. But don't expect him to be back in the play today. Plautus chose to break down the bridge and delay him on his way home. It is typical Plautus style. There is self-awareness of the situation of being in a play that's removed from reality. Indeed, the prologue speculates that some of the audience will be questioning the realism of what's being presented. When were slaves ever allowed to marry? He points out that the action takes place elsewhere and in the Greek world where such things were allowed. He suggests a bet with the audience, with the loser buying the drinks. He gets no takers and thinks that's probably just as well, as the audience are probably drunk enough already. To finish, he returns to the plot, revealing that the girl will prove to be freeborn and pure by the end of the play. So all will end well. But then he undercuts that by adding that outside of the play, and where a little money is exchanged, anything is possible, and who needs to wait for the niceties of a wedding ceremony where pleasures with a young lady are concerned? And so the prologue and the audience become complicit in the artifice of the play. The tone is conspiratorial banter. The prologue himself is not an actor in the play, but he has one foot in it, so to speak, and one in the real world. Breaking the convention of the fourth wall is nothing new. The distance of time adds to that complexity for us. When he refers to modern plays as being not as good as this about to be presented classic, do we think of that in the Roman context, or compare it to the last piece of experimental theatre we saw that was perhaps a tad pretentious or mildly incomprehensible? Because of the passing of time and lack of evidence, we tend to think of Roman comedy as homogeneous, but this prologue suggests that there is quite a distinction between those being presented as new plays and this one by Plautus, which, the prologue argues, can be seen as a classic even though it's only about one generation or so old. The audience don't know it at the moment, but the girl in question, the eponymous Casina, never appears in the play, although a slave disguised as her does. If she did appear, then she would be played by a man. So what are the audience, who understand the convention, imagining as the prologue makes his lewd comments about her? It's that kind of ambiguity that abounds in Plautus, and played with a knowing nudge and a wink, it's easy to see the comic appeal for playing with this. The prologue withdraws with a final flourish and compliment to the audience, and the play proper starts, with urgency as two slaves enter in mid-conversation. Olympio is all rude jokes and physical gesture bordering on violence. His companion Chalinus is more passive and easier going. The former represents the well-known stereotype of the unsophisticated country slave, the latter the well-mannered town slave. Olympio is fed up with being closely followed like my shadow, he says, by Chalinus, who in turn orders him to go back to his farm and accuses him of planning to kidnap Casina. Amid a verbal slanging match, which we assume was accompanied by slapstick fights, trips, punches and falls, Olympio admits that this is exactly his plan and taunts his rival with the idea of how he'll enjoy Casina once she is his. His abuse turns to the physical labours he'll put Chalinus to, and then sexual, as he describes how Chalinus will be forced to listen while he makes love to Casina. He comically imagines the sweet things she will say to him and, we assume, acts some of them out for his rival's benefit. Olympio exits to the house, and Chalinus follows closely and, it's safe to say, with the audience's sympathies. Scene 2 features the main female characters and was probably sung. Cleostrata, the wife of Lysidamus, and her servant Pardalisca provide a small prelude, as Cleostrata makes it clear she will not provide the breakfast her husband is demanding, and she's off to see her neighbour. She directly conflates his appetite for food with his sexual appetites, and resolves to deny him both, as she's discovered his plan to install Casina as his mistress. This sets her up as the standard shrewish wife stock character, although that is quite far from what she eventually turns out to be. Her neighbour Myrrhina comes out, and the women soon turn to gossip in their mutual companionship. Cleostrata explains her husband's plan and her affront at it. Her distaste is not only for the deception, but that the object of his desires belongs to her and has been raised kindly at her expense. The betrayal is very personal, and as the girl is a member of the close household, perhaps the implication is that there's something of a bit incestuous about it too. Myrrhina's responses are unsympathetic, advocating that men should be allowed their affairs as long as they don't disrupt the home life. One can imagine that the Roman audience might be very much split over who to support here. The reality of their position is emphasised when Cleostrata spots her husband, and Myrrhina quickly hurries off. Cleostrata remains, but aside, probably in one of the alcoves, hidden but present. Lysidamus delivers a jaunty monologue about the joyous effect of love, maintaining the food and passion metaphor that the women had started earlier in the scene. The Latin rhyming is tetrameter, so something that perhaps compares to a patter song and may be accompanied by a jig. The old man is anticipating the success of his planned love affair, so plenty of opportunity for comic effect as he jaunts around the stage, his anticipation contrasted with his apparent lack of physical ability and advancing years. He then spots his wife, and in conspiratorial stage whispers to the audience, admits that he must behave himself while she's around. He tries to turn on the charm, but she will have none of it, and they bicker, dancing around the knowledge of his plan. This is typical Roman comedy, rooted in the domestic and the personal. Lycidamus compares his marriage to a crucifixion, and as a retort, she questions his sense of duty to his family, accusing him of wandering the fleshpots in the city. He is the henpecked husband who is trapped in his marriage. She is the woman with no real power, except in the home, where she can take out all her frustrations on her husband. Eventually, he calls a stop to it and makes the suggestion of his slave marrying Casina. She counters that for loyalty to their son, Casina should marry his slave, and eventually both agree that if they can persuade either slave out of the arrangements, then the matter will be settled. As Cleostrata leaves, Lycidamus admits to the audience that his wife must have suspicions about the true aims of his plan. Chalinus enters and asks why his presence has been requested. In another piece of meta-theatre, Lycidamus suggests that the first thing the slave should do is to look a bit more cheerful when he's speaking to his master. Chalinus cannot, of course, change his expression without a change of mask. Lycidamus then offers him his freedom in return for giving up his claim on Casina, but the slave will have none of it, perhaps doubting Lycidamus's authority. After all, his master is the unseen sun, and so far all we've seen of Lycidamus is his ineffectiveness and lack of authority, first with his wife, and then with his slave. Plautus is subverting the expectation of the character types for comic effect. Dismissing the slave, he decides that the matter will be decided by drawing lots. His self-pitying aside to the audience is interrupted when Olympio enters, protesting back towards the house that he will never agree to the proposal that he abandon Casina, but then admits to Lycidamus that all this bother is putting him off the idea. The old man tries to strengthen his resolve, pointing out that he is the master of the house. With multiple references comparing himself to Jupiter, he only extenuates his lack of real authority, but does manage to explain to Olympio how he's going to fix the drawing of the lots so all will be well soon. Abandoning the comparison to Jupiter, he now casts himself as a general leading his troops into battle. The household is firmly in two opposing camps. The drawing of the lots is a central scene, not because the audience are in suspense about what the outcome will be. They already know how this story ends, and how the characters always come to the same end, but because it's a strong comic scene with verbal jousting and physical comedy. Lycidamus mistakenly asks for Casina to be his rather than Olympio's, and he has to backpedal madly to try to maintain the pretense. The formality of the placing of the lots in the jar soon breaks down as the incantation to the gods is interrupted and attempts at physical violence take over. Husband and wife fight via their servants, who take the odd slap and punch from each other. Generally in Plautus, actual violence is rare, and it's usually left as a threat bubbling under the surface, so this actual, albeit comic violence is unusual. At last the lots are drawn, and Lycidamus and Olympio are hubristic in their celebration of the victory. Chalinus later comments on how the old man was jigging around the stage in celebration, and no doubt taunting his wife. The contrast between the two pairs is marked, and Cleostrata is soon ordered into the house to prepare the wedding feast. As they withdraw, Chalinus remains on stage, giving a short monologue, appealing for the audience's sympathy. He is clearly the downtrodden party, and this is where the play turns. He says, "If now I were to hang myself by the noose, I would release all my pain. But what's the use? I would put myself to the expense of a rope, and do the deed of those who gave nothing but abuse. What need is there for me, for indeed I'm dead even as it is." And then he withdraws, ready to overhear what the victorious pair have to say. Their conversation isn't pleasant. They plan not only the conquering of Casina, but Olympio looks forward to enforcing the privations he promised on Chalinus. In his overexcited state, the old man embraces Olympio until Chalinus begins to wonder where the object of his affections really lies. Olympio forces him off with a push, perhaps foreshadowing the treatment he might expect from Casina, and Lycidamus regains some self-control. He explains how he's arranged with his neighbour for him to be absent from his home, so that, with his wife entertained by Cleostrata in his own home, Lycidamus will have time alone to bed Casina. He is very pleased with his plan and sends Olympia off to get supplies for the wedding feast. The list of delicacies is long and revives the culinary metaphor from earlier in the play. Chalinus continues it when he's left alone, and he closes the scene with another monologue, which this time suggests how the tables can be turned on Lycidamus. Rather than going straight to Cleostrata and Chalinus at the opening of Act 3, there's a short scene between Lycidamus and his old neighbour Alcesimus. Alcesimus is a somewhat reluctant accomplice, feeling that Lycidamus is being far too free with his fun, but agrees to help as Lycidamus leaves to attend to business in the forum. Cleostrata enters from the home in an enraged state. Although she previously had said she knew of her husband's plans, she clearly did not know all the details, and in particular that he intended to bed his new concubine almost literally on her doorstep. She resolves not to call Marina to her home as she had promised to do. She tells Alcesimus she needs no help and exits the scene, lingering in her doorway. He is confused and angry at being dragged into Lycidamus's plotting. Cleostrata then asides to the audience that the next part of her plan just needs her husband to return, which he conveniently does. He recalls how he wasted his time in the forum, too distracted by thoughts of Casina to help out a relative who'd asked him to court as a character witness. This abandonment of family would have been particularly keenly observed by the Roman audience, and Lycidamus again shows that he has few or no redeeming qualities. Cleostrata easily puts her plan into action by telling her husband that Alcesimus would not send his wife over to help. He is enraged at his neighbour's unreliable behaviour, and she exits, promising the audience that, "This day I'll render this lovesick fool completely miserable." That promise preludes a scene that relies on the quick and timely entrances and exits of the characters. It's the beginning of farce as we still know it today, with timing and comic coincidence being the key to the humour. This is fast-paced stuff, with doors opening and closing in rapid succession. Lycidamus and Alcesimus fall into a row over each other's perceived bad faith. Their shouting match and loss of dignity is the complete opposite of how the Roman paterfamilias was supposed to behave. The concept of the paterfamilias comes from the base unit of Roman society, being the house or home. All property rights were vested in the most senior male in the family, and it was a family that could include several generations, more distant unmarried female relatives, and all the associated household slaves and employees. Even adult sons had no responsibility for household and family matters unless the paterfamilias chose to invest some responsibility on them. Hence, we find the character of the wayward, dissolute son appearing in Roman comedies very regularly. The paterfamilias role came with serious responsibilities. He was expected to raise healthy children and to ensure their and his own moral well-being. Maintaining the honour of his family and ancestors was an important part of the role, and it was through this that the ancient bonds of Roman kinship that went right back to the earliest days of the Republic were maintained. Theoretically, at least, the family head had the power of life and death over his extended family, although there's little evidence that this right was ever exercised in practice. The moral aspect of the role was an important one, and Emperor Augustus infused the position further into society when he issued his edicts on the morality of marriage. He positioned himself not only as the first citizen, but as father to the empire. He wanted to be seen as the paterfamilias for the family of Rome, and responsible for the moral and physical well-being of the citizens. This, of course, was after Plautus, but even in his time, the portrayal of Lycidamus would have carried a lot of underlying understanding from the audience about the way the head of a household should behave, making his various failures to do so very obvious and very comic. Plautus then turns up the pace with the exit of Alcesimus as Podaliska, Cleostratus' servant, enters, reporting shocking events indoors. In a style that parodies the tragic poetic form, she reports how Casina has lost her senses, threatened her mistress, and promised that she would kill the man she sleeps with. "She'll murder me?" shouts Lycidamus in terror. "Hang on, what's it got to do with you?" asks the clever servant, relishing his discomfort at the slip of the tongue. He protests that his concern was only for his servant, but she plays her advantage and says that Casina's intention is to murder master and slave. Lycidamus is now seriously worried for his safety and considers donning armour, but decides to send his wife in to placate the young woman instead. Lycidamus prevents him from entering the house, and as he tries to push past, Lycidamus reminds him of his position. Olympio in turn reminds the old man of the freedom that he's been promised, and the tables are turned. Lysidamus uses subservient language to try to placate Olympio, and we get to the crux of the moral message of the play. Thanks to his lustful behaviour and deceitfulness, the normal rules of society have been reversed, and the slave is now behaving like the master, with the master becoming subservient. Olympio is ordering Lysidamus about now, telling him to make sure that the supper is ready and the wine properly prepared. He's only stopped when he's told of Casina's deadly intent, and agrees that they should go in together, ending the scene with a bit of fun over who can engineer to get the other to lead the way. When Pardalisca enters for the beginning of Act 5, there's been a short passage of time. Possibly there was a musical interlude, maybe an interval. We don't have any indication of how the staging of a performance in this way worked. Given the relatively short plays, the nature of the audience and the site of the performance, I doubt an interval that interrupted the action too much was necessary or appropriate, but a musical interlude is a possibility. Pardalisca's monologue, like her previous one, is animated and excited. She reports in breathless tones how the master and his servant are being thwarted by their household servants, who at Cleostratus' command are delaying their meal by any means possible. The old man is in a frustrated rage, and still he doesn't know the high point of Cleostratus' plan, to substitute her son's slave into the marriage bed, disguised as Casina. Lysidamus enters, calling back to his wife indoors that he will forego the banquet and accompany the newlyweds to the country estate to ensure their safety. Pardalisca, enjoying his discomfort, shares an aside with the audience and is then sent off. Olympio enters dressed for the wedding ceremony, and Lysidamus calls him a co-husband. They both compare their physical hunger to their lust for Casina. Musicians are called, and they sing a wedding song. Chalanus, dressed as a bride, enters, followed by Pardalisca, Cleostrata, and Marina. The text parodying the wedding ceremony is brief, and we should probably imagine much stage business as the men try to get a look at the bride, but are prevented by the intervention of the women, or by movement around the alcoves and pillars. Once again, the comedy is coming from the visual, the in-joke about the disguise not being realistic, where the audience are expected to suspend disbelief for the sake of the comedy. But all the time, Cleostrata is there, silent but present as the orchestrator of the scene. With the pseudo-ceremony complete, the women are sent back to the house, requesting that the men treat the innocent Casina gently. That is the last thing in their thoughts, and they try to manhandle her with clumsy embraces. She, that is Chalanus disguised as Casina, a man playing a man disguised as a woman, puts them off with a sharp dig of an elbow and a stamp of a foot on theirs, but is eventually carried off to the house next door, and to the men hope, to bed. Act 5 opens with the women coming on stage having eaten well indoors, and now looking to enjoy the fallout from Cleostratus' scheme. Olympio rushes from the house and tells the audience how he managed to get the bride away from the old man and try to woo her in a darkened room. But as he tried to kiss her, all that he felt was the prickle of a beard and then a punch in the face, at which point he made a quick exit. The women reveal themselves to Olympio and tease him, wanting to know all the details of his conquest of Casina. The text is very fragmentary over the next section, and it's been speculated that this is because it was a particularly rude section, as the women refer to Olympio's sexual prowess, or lack of it, and it's easy to imagine the sort of wordplay and innuendo that features in a bawdy sex comedy. For example, in one section, Olympio describes how he searched Casina for a sword, and thought he had it when he grabbed at something hard, but it was warm to the touch, so how could that be? Just as the women ask how the old man had fared, he emerges, throwing himself dramatically onto the stage. He is humiliated and distraught. He's lost his cloak and a walking stick, so visually he's taking on the role of the slave. The text is lost, but presumably he retells how he too was beaten up by Chalanus, believing it to be Casina refusing his advances. He speaks about needing to run off, so becoming a parody of the well-used stock character of the messenger slave. The very deliberate nature of that image is reinforced when Lysidamus is called back as he's about to leave. This recalling was a common feature of the messenger-slave role, so much as Lysidamus tries to ignore it, he stays on stage. The call that stops him is from Chalanus as Casina, asking for a return to the bedroom. Cleostrata parodies the call from her own doorway, and Lycidamus is caught between a rock and a hard place. He tries to squirm out of it, blaming Bacchus, but the women reveal that they know exactly what has been going on. The reference to Bacchus is possibly a topical one. At the time, the Bacchic cult members had caused much disruption in Rome with their anarchic rites, and the Senate had banned their ceremonies by decree in 186 BCE. There had been a prolonged period of social unrest after the privations caused by the Second Punic War, and the decrees may have been part of a more general attempt to exert senatorial control over the city, rather than being a specific concern about the activities of the Bacchic cult in particular. Much of the detail we think we have about the cult comes from Livy, who was writing a couple of centuries later. His very lurid accounts of the cult are now thought to be a repetition of the most exotic and scandalous stories circulated about them, and probably the real truth of their activities is now lost to the passing of time. Olympio sees how the old man is trapped and turns against him, blaming him for his own misfortunes. Lycidamus pleads for forgiveness from his wife and promises to behave himself in future. Initially it seems she will chide him further, but at Marina's prompting and with this self-aware line, she relents. "I'll do as you request and grant this pardon, but it's just so this play won't outstay its welcome any further." She asks for his cloak and stick to be given back to him, thereby restoring his dignity. The short epilogue tells us that the original Greek play ended with Casina being revealed as the daughter of Alcesimus, and that she was married to Lycidamus's son. But obviously the amendments Plautus made have made it a much better play, and some applause would be appreciated here. So the plot and the characters were tried and tested, and the level of amusement the audience took from this play was, it seems to me, completely dependent on the visual presentation of it, and the suspension of disbelief that is required with the farcical premise and situations. It's the conspiratorial nature of the relationship between the characters and the audience that achieved this best. We're in on the joke in the same way that we accept a stage whisper is not heard by another character, or a character in a sitcom can't see the challenge that they're walking straight into. We know this is being done for comic effect, and I think we can safely say that no one in a Roman audience had expectations above a good time when they sat or stood in the marketplace in front of a temporary stage. We might go to a farce and admire it for the artifice and theatricality on display, but I'm not sure that the Roman level of performance had quite that level of discernment about the art of the farce. The play is fun and funny, and that's all that we should expect. I mentioned before how important the translation or adaptation is in our appreciation of these plays. When I looked at Casina, I used 3 different translations, and the difference between them is striking. The 2 older translations are both, I think, rather literal, and don't attempt to use idioms or rhyme in the way to make them accessible and good for performance, even for the sensibilities of our own time. You'll remember from my conversation with Dr. Palliar that there's a general view now that texts were treated too reverently by scholars, and that, by being treated as a literary work, the plays lost their original intent as pieces for performance and enjoyment. The modern translation I used by Richard Beecham was clearly done with performance in mind, and comic performance at that. That's not to say it isn't scholarly. Professor Beecham is very experienced and respected in the field of Roman plays and their presentation, but he clearly had the idea of the comic performance in the centre of his thinking. I'll give you a very short example. At the end of the play, Chalinus hands Lycidamus his cloak and stick with a joke. In a 19th century translation by Henry Riley, he says, "Take them if you wish. Upon my faith, a great injustice has really been most egregiously done me. I've been married to 2 husbands, neither of them behaved to me as a newborn bride." In Richard Beecham's translation, the same lines are, "Just consider my plight is all I ask, for I think it is a sin to be wed to 2 men, neither of whom managed the task." That, it seems to me, captures the intent and style of the original so much better. If you choose to read plays, choose your translation carefully. Studying this play closely has certainly been an interesting exercise. There is more humour in it than I found on first reading, and the theatrical nature of it, and other Plautus plays, is impressive. There is an art here, which may be a bit different from the art we know now, but the self-awareness and theatricality of the piece still appeals. However, I think a commercial production would still be difficult to pull off today. The problem is with the gender relations and the female characters. As a historical piece and an academic study, we can, on an intellectual level, allow for the fact that the role of women was very different from today in Roman society. But for a piece presented for pure enjoyment, I think the misogyny of the male characters, particularly the treatment of Casina as property of the men, is perhaps a stretch too far for modern sensibilities. The other female characters do have strength. After all, Cleostrata orchestrates almost all of the second half of the play. But in the end, the social norms are restored, and there has been no real exchange of power or social position. That doesn't mean we can't enjoy the piece, but theatre can and should do so much more. Next time, more Plautus as we dive into the world of the Menaechmus brothers. It's a story of much confusion between two identical twins, and a tale that will seem pretty familiar to you. Plautus has a lot of fun with the concept of the identical twins, as he takes us to Epidamus in Greece, where the lost brothers eventually become reunited. But of course, there's a lot of fun to be had along the way. If you'd like to support the podcast, please find us on patreon.com or ko-fi.com, or please take a couple of minutes to rate and review on Apple Podcasts to help other theatre folk find us. All support helps to keep things going here and is gratefully received. And please do join us by following the Twitter account for conversations about history and theatre more generally, and keep up to date with the plans for the podcast. I look forward to your company next time, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or via Twitter @thoetp.